Well, good evening. Good evening. I used to work at the Acton Institute, which is a major sponsor of this year's conference. And there was a motto at the Acton Institute: we start on time and we end on time. And so we're going to start right on time, and hopefully people will still trickle in. Never fear, the introduction is somewhat lengthy, so that people who miss the first couple minutes can only just miss my introductory comments. In any case, my name is Jordan Baller. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this first evening plenary of the 2024 Kuyper Conference. In his opening speech at the Social Congress in Amsterdam in 1891, Kuyper lamented the fact that the Free University had not yet produced any economists working from a reformed worldview who could provide expertise on the problem of poverty. One unfortunate result of the state's monopoly on higher education in our country is that we have not yet, as yet, produced any specialists, Kuyper observed. None of us at this Congress, he said, stands out as an authority on economics. Now, the Free University had only been in existence just over a decade, and it would be nearly another decade and a half before the university's first professor of economics, P.A. Diepenhorst, would be appointed in 1904. The Free University itself had been founded for the purpose of engaging all areas of academic thought from a distinctively reformed perspective, a perspective grounded in a particular understanding of the human person created in God's image. Kuyper himself raised the anthropological question directly in the build-up to his most famous quotation. Man, be he a fallen sinner or an evolving product of nature, shows up in every department and every discipline as the subject that thinks or the object that invites thought. Not one segment of our intellectual world can be hermetically sealed off from the others, and there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not call out mine. Kuyper and the anti-revolutionaries were at a disadvantage in 1891 as they took up the problem of poverty without economic expertise to assist in their deliberations. But now, more than a century later, we are truly left without any such excuse or limitation. We've been blessed with generations of economists working in the Reformed tradition who have kept the Reformed understanding of the human person central in their social scientific inquiries, and more broadly for Christian economists. Indeed, we are about to hear from one of the leading representatives of this tradition, combining a living faith with keen scholarship. Dr. Sarah Hamersma is Associate Professor and Director of Doctoral Studies in Public Administration and International Affairs Department at Syracuse University. She's also a Senior Research Associate at the Center for Policy Research and the Lerner Center for Public Health Promotion and Population Health, and she has affiliations with the Center for Aging and Policy Studies and the Aging Studies Institute. She earned her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is an alumna of Calvin College. Much of her most recent research focuses on health and nutrition programs, examining their consequences for food insecurity, health outcomes, and labor supply. She's an accomplished economist, full stop. But she's also an economist of faith. And not only an economist of faith, but an economist who has worked hard to faithfully integrate her religious conviction with her academic discipline. She serves as a contributing editor for Comment Magazine and has given numerous presentations on the relationship between faith and economics, including this past summer at the Association of Christian Economists meeting just down the road in Holland, Michigan, where the conference theme was Economics for the Common Good, the work of Christian economists. She spoke powerfully and memorably in a plenary session on the topic of rehumanizing health economics, putting the human person back into our considerations. Indeed, I can think of no one better positioned to help us answer the vital question, why economists and people of faith need each other. Please help me welcome Dr. Sarah Hamersma.
I don't need my name tag. You all know who I am now. Class of 99. I'm back. 25 years. It is impossible to believe. Thank you so much, Jordan, for inviting me. And I hope that I can sort of live up to the hype of what I'll be bringing tonight. What I thought I would do tonight is actually trying to pull together a couple of pieces of thought. So I gave a talk many years ago to a graduate InterVarsity group on this sort of theme about economists and people of faith. As you might imagine, in that room, most people are not economists. They're pretty sure that economists need some help. So that part isn't hard to convince, but the other way around, what do we really need economists for? And so I had a bit of a talk along those lines. And I'm doing some work recently, and Jordan has heard some about it, thinking really carefully and trying to work my way through some very specific areas in which I think that economics and people of faith need to speak well to one another and acknowledge each other's limitations. And so what I'm going to do tonight is walk you through some of that larger thought process about why economists and people of faith need each other. And I've tried to make both sides of that argument reasonably meaty, because as much as I assume you all feel that economists probably need some help, I want to make sure that you know what kind of help we need. And I also want to make sure you know what kind of help we can offer, what we bring to the table. And in so doing, I'm going to spend a little bit of time walking through some examples from that work that I'm currently doing related to rehumanizing. So I hope that this is really helpful tonight, and I just very much appreciate being here. Well, let's see if I can. I tried it earlier. Steve, did you touch this? This happened in his session too. Ash is gone. I need him back. How did it die in such a short time? The light works. But it really, there's no computer up here, so I don't have oh, I feel terrible asking you to do that. Well, maybe you could, we'll get started. Hopefully it will be solved. Thank you so much. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. And you'll have to, the things are going to appear along the slide, so there's going to be a lot of clicking. I'm sorry. So I like to just start any talk, particularly to a group of Christian brothers and sisters, with a disclaimer so that you understand sort of what an economist is, and particularly my generation of an economist. So this is going to be my disclaimer. Click. I'm an economist trained relatively recently. I used to say recently. I'm not sure that's quite right. But by recently, I mean in the tradition that my PhD training is primarily quantitative. So when people describe something like an economic model, they don't mean circles with arrows describing how things link one to another like a flow chart. An economic model involves calculus usually. So everything is mathematized. That's my training. Click. Click again. This is George Stigler. Here's something important to know about the training in economics. In 1972, economist George Stigler at Chicago successfully proposed that the history of thought requirement be dropped at Chicago. Most other economics departments later followed suit. At the same meeting, Stigler unsuccessfully proposed that the economic history requirement also be dropped. I think he got his wish later on that one. History of economic thought is not taught in PhD programs in economics. So it is called a doctorate of philosophy, but there is not a philosophy element. I just want that to be very clear. Or rather, there's a default philosophy element, which is neoclassical economics. So this means I've not had training in the history of economic thought except for a course as an undergraduate at Calvin College. That was my experience. That's why I know what an institutionalist is. I would otherwise have never heard of such a thing. I may not have known that there were serious Marxists doing economics. I may not have known about the Austrian school. Thankfully, I had one semester with Roland Hochberg, if you know him, he's wonderful. Luckily for me, as George Stigler says, one need not read the history of economics, that is past economics, to master present economics. Instead, the young theorist will assume that all that is valid in earlier work is present in purer and more elegant form in the modern theory, and that the history of the discipline is best left to those underendowed for fully professional work at the modern level. Wow. These are the people from whom I come. So that is why I give a disclaimer. We sometimes seem a little rough around the edges, but George Stigler's special even in that category. We're not encouraged in our discipline to be particularly reflective. about the discipline, it doesn't bother most of us that much. In fact, it doesn't bother most people at all, as far as I can tell, but maybe it should. And so that's what I've been wrestling with over these last few years, thinking a bit more about that. Go ahead. And so I ask, what value does economics training bring to help the world of policy, business, and society, and what is missing from that? And then, what role do people of faith have in advocating for policies that honor the image of God and work toward human thriving and the common good? And what are they missing if they don't pay attention to economists? There is a confidence, I want you to understand the humor of this. There's a confidence monitor there, and I chose a font too small to see my own slide on the confidence monitor. So that's why I'm standing so awkwardly. I'm actually going to hold this and just turn a little sideways. So want to get everybody on the same page. Economics is the study of the production, allocation, and distribution of scarce resources. Economists are given a level of authority in policymaking that is beyond that of any other social science by orders of magnitude. And I actually looked into this at one point. The sheer number of economists in Washington, D.C., for instance, dwarfs the number of political scientists, sociologists. The only thing that might match it is statisticians. Economics is strong when it's used as a way of analyzing the potential effects of policies designed by people who had a particular goal in mind already. The goal is already set. Economics does a great job of telling us what will happen when we try these different kinds of policies. Where we might run into trouble is if we aren't sure how these work and we don't talk to an economist first. So that's part of what we're going to bring to the table today as economists. So sometimes economists attempt to dispassionately analyze policies that actually are moral minefields. And what economists think they're doing is just being very objective. Holding it at arm's length, let's just study this thing. So women's suffrage, women's voting has caused growth in government. That was a very negative finding for the person who wrote that paper. They were disappointed. Black-white earnings differentials reflect huge skill differentials that were already there as teenagers. They don't reflect nearly as much labor market level discrimination as was once thought. This is a touchy issue. Abortion legalization reduced crime 18 years later. I'll be coming back around to that kind of stuff. That's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the rehumanization that we need. So we are the dismal science, so just a couple examples of other kinds of research we do. The deadweight loss of Christmas is a very famous paper we often teach in our classes. It shows that if people don't know you well, some of the money they spend on you is more likely to be wasted. And so the people who buy you gift cards are doing that to try to reduce that waste because they know they don't know you well enough to get you something personal. And then markets for infant adoption. Increasing compensation to suppliers could improve efficiency, increasing the number of transactions. Boy, yeah. I have a long quote about that I don't have time for, but if you want to talk about it later, I can give you the full version. And so to summarize, economics can answer a lot of questions about various effects of policies. With a standard set of tools, we've got a whole toolbox full. They allow us to compare and contrast different kinds of policies, what kinds of effects they're likely to have, working in what people's incentives are, working in what their constraints are. But economics is out of its element when setting or judging policy goals themselves. Advocacy is a four-letter word among economists. If you're doing advocacy work, you've left. You've turned on us. We don't advocate. We just dispassionately just study things. That's the deal. Well, then who's setting the agenda? I'll argue today, well, sometimes the economists are setting the agenda. They just don't mean to or just are hiding it. Depends. But I want to argue someone else should be setting the agenda. So proposition 1 of 2, you can guess what the second one is as well. Proposition 1 is economists need people of faith. People with strong convictions of all kinds have power in making policy by voicing their concerns. I'd like to propose that people of faith have an opportunity to be a strong voice in the process of setting public policy goals or priorities. This is not the same as just advocating for specific programs, and I'll come back to that. What's on God's policy agenda? I decided not to make a list here. I thought I'd see what you think. What's on God's policy agenda? Justice. Human dignity. Freeing people from bondage. Amen. Life. Life, not death. All right, so God's got a policy agenda. Notice those things are priorities, they're not programs. And so when I'm thinking about what economists don't do well, it's articulating those priorities. What they are able to do well is study the programs and what they do. So economists cannot use economic analysis itself to decide whether a particular right or a benefit or a constraint, regulation should be adopted. There's nothing in economics that tells you what's good. We have measures of things like efficiency, but they may or may not be good with a capital G. So it depends on the priorities and convictions of the public and their representatives as to what policy priorities might get pushed forward. In that case, an economic analysis can assess the progress toward a goal, but it cannot, or at least should not, set goals. It's not equipped to do that at all. So economists need people of faith. Now, what I want to give you is, can you go back for 1 second? An extended application. So this is going to go to a little piece of a project that I'm working on, and then I'll come back to the main talk. So this is our application to rejecting dehumanization. And this, I mean, to be an example for you to see how I'm trying to work through what it would look like to try to inform the way that economics is being done in a way that rejects dehumanization. And so let me first say I'm part of my piece of being an economist as a health economist. Health economics covers a broad interest in understanding the usual economic focal points. Again, production, allocation, and distribution of resources, toward the end of drawing connections with what leads to healthy lives. People who are doing well, well-being. Well-being is a measure that gets used. That dry definition stands in some contrast, I think, to a rich theological understanding of a principle of imago Dei, the image of God. And so what I want to use as my example today is something called the consistent life ethic, or formerly the seamless garment. Cardinal Joseph Bernardin describes it this way: the spectrum of life cuts across the issues of genetics, abortion, capital punishment, modern warfare, and the care of the terminally ill. You might be a CLE if you're disliked by everyone for something. That's how you know. It's actually an incredibly difficult position to hold. I don't know very many people who really hold it, and I feel that it would be a strong claim to say that I fully do, but I do find it to be a great guidepost. And so I'm going to be thinking about a consistent life ethic as a framework for how we think about rehumanizing in a profession that has a tendency to dehumanize. I thought I'd show you a couple illustrations from some of the CLE groups. No lethal injections for the ill, the accused, or the unborn. This is a sign produced by Rehumanize International. The groups I talk about here, some are religious and some are not. And so when I'm thinking about people of faith, some of these, I think these contributions are really broad. They're people of conviction. Some of them are more specific to the Christian faith. Here's another one, don't discriminate. Protect the tiny humans. An anti-discrimination approach to thinking about the rights of the unborn. And so this is Beth Fox. She's, I believe, the chair of the board of Rehumanize. She has very serious respiratory issues and is in a wheelchair. And they knew that she was not well before she was born, but she was allowed to be born, and she lives a rich and a life of impact, which has been just amazing to watch. And it's great to hear from her if you ever get the opportunity. So what I'm trying to do, thinking as a person in my shoes, a researcher, a thinker, an academic, a scholar, is what does it look like for me to try, as a person of faith, to think about setting an agenda for what should be studied and how we could rehumanize the way we approach these kinds of questions. So these are just a few general principles I hope you could apply in the kind of thinking you do. One is to move back a step in your research questions by questioning the assumed starting point of others that might be in your field. So an example in my field is work that presumes an unwanted pregnancy already exists and then asks about policies that will go only forward from that without thinking if there are policies that could prevent that in the first place. Second, noticing adjustments in language use that implicitly convey values. So my initial expectation in economics, I work in health issues, as I said, is when I go to a maternal and infant health session at a conference, there are people who are studying things like exposure to toxins of pregnancy and during pregnancy and the effects on the mother and the unborn child. They're looking at the effects on the born child after they are born. Looking at questions about substance use during pregnancy, what kinds of policies or programs can help a healthy birth to happen. When I'm at those sessions, it's easily agreed upon in the room with no one saying anything that we hope that the babies are doing well. Nobody has to say it. We hope the babies are doing well. We don't like the pollution that makes them sick before they're born. We don't like the substances that can get in their system and give them neonatal abstinence syndrome. We do like them to have food. We do like them to have health care. So all of that is assumed in a room when you go to a health economics conference and you're listening to someone who studies maternal and infant health. At the same conference, you may go to another session. Some of the same people may be presenting, and they'll be talking about reproductive rights. And in that session, there will not be a sense in the room that there's a child's life or health at stake. It will be unspoken again, but the unspoken is very different. The unspoken is, that's not relevant. So I came in thinking maybe they would discuss, maybe they would use less humanizing language, like describing a fetus or an embryo, or maybe the famous clump of cells. One of my favorite buttons from Rehumanize International is a big button that says, I am a clump of cells. You can wear it. They don't mention clumps of cells, fetuses, embryos. They don't mention anything. It's the kind of dehumanization that is silence, right? It is just a failure to acknowledge at all. Same kinds of people, same kind of conference, different unstated assumptions in the room. And so those are the kinds of things I'm trying to notice as I think about what needs to be done, as I think about moving forward as a person of faith to try to ask good questions and move us forward. Third is noticing what is not in the literature and asking why it's not there. A real easy and sort of obvious version of this is we compare the outcomes of women who did and did not have abortions, but we don't compare the outcomes of their children. Just, that isn't really done. It would be a very short paper. There'd be one column with outcomes and there'd be one blank column with no information because none of them are alive. No one wrote that paper. I'd like to write that paper. It's very short, but quite provocative, don't you think? So this is the kind of interrogation I'm thinking about, and I hope you can think of how you can interrogate the disciplines that you're in, even to the extent that I know many of you are in a Christian environment. What are the things that are unspoken? What are the things that need to be articulated? And so my desire to do the good work here is to really reframe, identify where the field is thick, where it is thin, where it is missing. What are the questions that the priorities of someone who wants people humanized want answered? If the people who are currently doing the work aren't interested in that rehumanization, what do we do to bring that to the table? An example of this process is there's clear evidence from work from an award-winning APAM scholar that women appreciate having access to abortion pills and that the rates of complications for women are fairly low. That may set off alarm bells for you because you may have heard otherwise. That's a problem. She's right. The research is very clear. Instead of arguing that these things are not true, I suggest we instead seek to thicken the thin parts of the literature. What's missing? We've got the answers to some very specifically posed questions that actually set you up very easily for a certain kind of policy advocacy. What are the questions we're not asking and answering? And so just one example is the existing literature on abortion in economics is focused on understanding interventions on the supply side. Restrictions, distance to a clinic, access to pills, need for parental consent, all these kinds of things that are constraints on the supply, on where and when you could get abortions. What about the demand side? There's much less work there. Why do people want abortions? That's something that we should want to know more about. Because, hey, if we could solve some of those demand issues, maybe we wouldn't need to try to use the rather coarse efforts on the supply side, which, by the way, with the advent of the pill, are going nowhere fast. And so the people thinking about the demand side, it turns out, are not economists. So that should make you all happy who are not economists. It's actually others. And so I'm going to share a few of them with you, and they have some things in common. This is Frederica Matthews Green. This quote of hers was actually used by both pro-life and abortion rights groups. For the question remains, do women want abortion? Not like she wants a Porsche or an ice cream cone. Like an animal caught in a trap, trying to gnaw off its own leg, a woman who seeks abortion is trying to escape a desperate situation by an act of violence and self-loss. Abortion is not a sign that women are free, but a sign that they are desperate. You can see actually how this could get used by both sides. Frederica Matthews Green is pro-life. Next, we've got Charlie Camosy. Maybe some of you run in his circles. I'm still waiting to meet him. He's one of those superstars I'm hoping to cross paths with someday. He notes a couple of simple facts. Women of color have higher rates of opposition to abortion than others in survey work, and women of color have higher rates of abortion than others. What does this mean? Constraints are overriding preferences. This is actually right where an economist needs to be. Economics is built on these two things, that people make choices that are a combination of their preferences and constraints. The choice is not the preference. The choice is the constrained preference. It's what you actually can do. Preferences can be unattainable. Constraints are real, so choices have to meet those constraints. And then my new most favorite person, Leah Labresco-Sargent, who I also haven't met yet. Being a woman is not, legally speaking, a recognized disability. The exception is postpartum, when in the United States, recovery from pregnancy is classified as a temporary disability for the purpose of allowing mothers to claim unpaid leave under the Family Medical Leave Act. Our laws frame the capacity to give birth and nurture a child as an incapacity to keep pace with what we expect of the median human and worker. This is from Comment Magazine. Towards the end of the article, she says, a world that cannot accommodate children will not accommodate mothers. And so as I've been talking, you can see that I'm presuming some value on an unborn child. I'm not presuming everyone agrees with me on exactly what that value might be, but I am presuming that we all think it would be great if more of them made it. Treating women as defective men is a whole nother level of dehumanizing that we've added on. And these two things are inseparable. As long as we treat childbearing the way that we do and devalue the children, we're devaluing the people who would have the capacity to nurture them. So my conclusion from consulting those people, who are all people of faith, is the fact that having a child seems for so many to be truly infeasible suggests we have a fundamental social problem that, while perhaps muted by abortion access, and I'll talk a bit about that, goes much deeper than women's preferences about abortion to a lack of social support for the essential work of child rearing. Our problems are much bigger than who has access to abortion, when, and where. We don't want children. That's a really big problem, and our fertility rates show it. It's becoming a actual real issue that's getting some attention. No amount of typical economic policy research is going to get to the root of this. And so, right? Economists need people of faith. Economists aren't going to get there on their own. They need to listen to Charlie Camosy and Frederica Matthews-Green and Leah Labresco-Sargent, and they need to listen to all of you in the room. Thus it is proven, I hope. So we've got proposition 2. People of faith need economists. You do. You need us. If people of faith work to influence the priorities and goals of society, what do we really need economists for? If they really take the reins and bring their priorities to the table. So I'm going to walk us through a few thoughts on that. In the words of the Apostle Paul, by no means. Good preachers recognize when they can speak authoritatively and when it makes sense to consult an expert on a particular issue. And I'm sure many people have said that, but I heard it from Mark Knoll. I can't tell you how delighted I was one day to get a call from my pastor in the middle of the week because he was going to speak about something that he thought I might know something more about than he did, and he wanted a little help to make sure he didn't say something wrong. Wow, like what a great sign of a person who understands how to use the community to create the best and most appropriate message, right? Who isn't feeling too embarrassed to ask or too arrogant and just walks up to the podium and just figures, I already know everything I need to know. Economists are experts in examining behavioral incentives created by many types of laws and market interventions and assessing their effects. And we can do some of that theoretically, so you don't even have to try it out and crash and burn at first. We can tell you it's going to crash and burn. In fact, one of the people I admire most as an economist, she recently passed away of cancer, is Rebecca Blank. She's also a Christian economist. She was on the Council of Economic Advisors. When she gave a plenary talk, she said, most people don't understand, but the main role that we play is to stop the very, very, very bad ideas from ever being heard in public. People have all kinds of terrible ideas in private, in government, in federal government. And she said, we just try to stop as many of them as we can. And it's a very, very thankless task because you don't ever get to go out and say, like, we had a big win today. We stopped the political operatives from doing this horrible thing. Economists, we can do some of this work with theory without even wrecking everything. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of things that you can imagine someone feeling very strongly about, and then you can imagine an economist looking into, and it just becomes a little more complicated. Doesn't mean it's bad or good, but just a little more complicated. So let's say overtime pay. A group of Christians decides that overtime pay premiums are a matter of justice. Justice, we said that. That's one of God's priorities. Their goal is to improve compensation for workers and discourage exploitation by firms. These are good goals. And so an economist at the table might say, all right, would this change employment levels since firms will want to avoid having anyone with too many hours? Economic theory would tend to predict a move toward offering part-time jobs or at least not offering that overtime pay. Assuming the government does not fund the mandate, which seems likely, might the policy affect firms' base level of hourly wages? You know, there's some math you can do where if you currently pay someone, they work 50 hours at a certain wage, and now you're going to have to pay time and a half on those last 10 hours, you can change the wage in such a way that it adds up to the same number at the end, right? Firms might do that. What's going to stop them? It's not clear. So how will our group of well-meaning Christians whose hearts are in the right place react if their policy passes and it turns out people start losing hours at work or getting lower wages per hour? This could be really problematic. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but an economist is going to bring these things up and we're going to need to investigate further to try to see how sensitive that labor market is. Are those wages likely to change? Are those employment levels likely to change? It depends a bit on how substitutable those workers are. That's a thing that we can measure in economics, those kinds of questions. Another one is living wage. Suppose a group of Christians decides the lowest hourly wage offered in society should be enough to support a family of 4 if that person works full time. They want improved compensation for workers. Some would say maybe dignity is part of that, or a piece of what that means. Reducing poverty and allowing for a parent to stay home with children more easily, being able to live on one income. All of these things, again, wonderful goals. And so an economist is there and just asks questions. Again, I'm not saying that the answer to these questions precludes the policy, but that it has to be in the discussion. Since it increases employers' costs, will it reduce the number of workers they hire if they need to pay a higher wage? Economic theory almost always predicts that if the wages are higher, there would be fewer job openings. Might it create a surplus of willing workers relative to the fewer remaining jobs? This, I think, is underappreciated, and it has to do with supply and demand curves. But if we are thinking about fewer job openings, that higher wage at the same time creates more job applicants. And so that gap between the number of applicants and the number of jobs could be large. And who gets those jobs? This is a really important question, because if the reason we raised that wage was to help the least of these, they may be at the bottom of that applicant pool. They may be the ones that get cut out. So we really need to ask those questions. Would it possibly increase the price of the products that are produced or the services that are provided, lowering purchasing power for a large number of consumers, possibly those same ones that you're trying to help? Might it reduce the value people place on furthering their education, because there isn't a big gain to getting more education if a living wage is set reasonably high? All questions we just need to know something about. How will we react? It's just better to have an economist at the table with you who's on the same page, who cares about these same priorities, to try to walk you through what are ways that we could think about trying to accomplish these goals with as little harm as possible, as few unintended consequences as possible. Just as a fun example of the distinction between promoting goals and policies, I study poverty, and so reducing poverty could be a goal. And I just thought it would be helpful for you to see, if you came to the table and just said, I want to reduce poverty, there's at least this many ways that we could talk about it. You could give poor people cash. You could tell firms to pay poor people more money. You could provide free education to improve earning power. You could pay firms to hire poor people. You could develop a tax system that redistributes to the poor. You could target relief to certain demographic groups correlated with poverty. You could provide free childcare and transportation to make it easier for people to work. You could just change the way poverty is measured, and you can reduce poverty. There are a lot of ways. There is no reason that the church needs to know which of these ways is going to work best. There's a good reason to have an economist at the table in that conversation, especially if there's going to be efforts to advocate for specific policies rather than people. And when I think about my research, I think of myself as wanting to advocate for the well-being of people rather than supporting policies or shoring up policies that I think are important. And I think that's something that varies across the discipline in terms of how people think about, for instance, protecting the SNAP program. That's language that's used a lot. So the list goes on. I hope I've convinced you some that people of faith need economists. But I'm going to do one more piece. This is my other extended application. This one was not part of any talk I've done before. This piece is a new piece, but related to the dehumanization issues. So you may have heard of a recent Supreme Court case, Dobbs versus Jackson, related to abortion rights. 2 of the amicus briefs submitted for the case provide a really interesting illustration to me of how economists and people of faith broadly construed, meaning sort of people with a belief and a position and a set of priorities, can talk right past each other. Now, neither of these amicus briefs made a lick of difference in the case. They really don't have anything to do with who won or who lost, but I'm using them to help illustrate some of the issues that can arise. So I'm going to show you them in order because it's clear the second one was written having read the first one. So I'm going to show you the first one first. This is the statement, a brief of 240 women, scholars, and professionals in pro-life feminist organizations. It's a long name. These, I didn't check, but these would typically be people like, say, Leah Labresco-Sargent. Erica Bakioki is one of the leaders, writers of this piece. So 240 women scholars and professionals and pro-life feminist organizations wanted to have some say. And so they submitted an amicus brief. As you might know, you have to submit it on one side of the case. There isn't a way to just submit an expert statement. You're choosing a side when you submit an amicus brief. And I had this conversation with the person who wrote the other one to sort of say, I can't sign something because it's supporting a particular side of the case, and that's not something I'm willing to do, regardless of whether I agree with the contents of the statement. Fortunately, neither of them asked me to sign, and I wouldn't have signed either of them, so it all works out. So these 240 women write this piece. I'm just going to give you a couple hints about what it's about. This is the beginning. Notice how they situate themselves. Women, scholars, and professionals, a group of 240 women who have achieved academic and professional success and who reject the argument that the ability of women to participate equally in economic and social life of the nation requires the availability of abortion. The individual names, doctoral degrees, and degree-granting institutions are in the appendix. Who the heck do they think they are? They're doing this very intentionally because the argument that they're going to make is an argument related to the law that is being discussed. So the law being discussed is whether women have a, quote, reliance interest in maintaining access to abortion. That is what the case was about. Do women have a reliance interest? Meaning, is it necessary? Are women relying on abortion to have equal rights? And so they are saying, essentially, we have been extraordinarily successful women, and we can prove that we didn't need abortion to be successful women. So they really lay hard on that successful women thing. It's strategic. I don't think they're really that obnoxious in real life. The 240 women, some of them can be a little hard to listen to sometimes. I've watched some webinars, but the 240 women argue against the reliance interest argument for maintaining abortion access, suggesting there is no evidence that women's success depends on abortion. They provide philosophical arguments. They're good. They provide legal arguments. They're good, as far as I can know for both of these. Then things go a little sideways because the 240 women decide to start talking about economic research. So they critique a few of the existing studies on the effects of abortion access. One focus is on something called the Turnaway study. This was a study where researchers interviewed women who sought later term abortions and basically were right there when that woman found out if she was over the cutoff to qualify for an abortion or not, and was turned away from the clinic. So some women get the abortion, some women get turned away. They're at a similar part of pregnancy, just a little bit further along. This is what we call a quasi-experiment or a natural experiment in economics. It's our best case scenario for knowing what the effect of an abortion would be, because we've got people who are otherwise very similar, both showing up to the same place at the same time, looking for the same thing. One of them gets it, one of them doesn't. So the Turnaway study has there's good things to complain about. All the abortions are late term. Nobody will share the data. That's actually not a big surprise. When you invest that much in data collection, you don't always make it available. But the complaint one of the complaints that is made in this amicus brief is that the sample is too small and the treatment is too messy. And what I mean by that is women were turned away, but then they were able to find an abortion somewhere else. And some women may have been approved, but then didn't go through with it. And also people have babies afterward at various times. And they said, how can you look at these women's outcomes later on? It's too messy. Unfortunately, what they didn't realize is that all the problems that they've described actually make you less likely to find an effect of abortion. They all mess with the experiment in a way that works against the researcher. And what happens was the researchers, even in that context, found statistically significant, reasonably large impacts on things like poverty, likelihood of credit score issues, and education, levels of education, educational attainment. So the findings are actually even more robust because their sample was pretty small and their treatment and control groups were a little messy. If you think about it this way, let's say you had an experiment with a treatment and control group, but you accidentally treated half your control group and you accidentally didn't treat half your treatment group, you'd get no difference between them. So to whatever extent that happens, that things get mixed up, you're not likely to find much, and they found something. So, but I don't expect the people who wrote that amicus brief to understand that. That's technical stuff that you learn in statistics in graduate school, in economics. But they shot themselves in the foot a little bit there. They instead do their own correlational analysis and find no correlation between changes in abortion policies and changes in women's outcomes. And they note that while correlation does not imply causation, hope you all knew that, certainly there couldn't be causation if there isn't even correlation. Yeah, Steve gave me the grimace I was looking for. Except that's wrong. That's not true. Bias can go any direction when there's a confounding variable. My very favorite example of this is in the brilliant Scott Cunningham textbook called Causal Inference, the Mixtape. He is also a Christian economist. Wow, there's a lot of us around. There's a drawing in the book of a boat. The boat is trying to go straight across the lake from point A to point B. And the person is moving the rudder to get the boat to go straight. If you model the movements of the rudder and the behavior of the boat, they are uncorrelated. The rudder's this way, the rudder's that way. The boat just keeps going straight. They're uncorrelated. Is there no causality? There's definitely causality. What's missing? A confounding variable, the wind or the current, right? Something else. Something else can make two things look uncorrelated, just like it can make things look correlated. So, not solid research methods, but they do end beautifully, and I put a little clip in here. Ironically, under the guise of women's rights, equality arguments for abortion suggest that females are intrinsically blighted by their reproductive capacity to bear children. These arguments tend unwittingly, perhaps, to promote the male childless norm in educational and employment settings. Preach! That's what they're really good at talking about. The whole thing should read like that. All right, so then we've got what I'll call the response. This is 143 economists. The lead writer of this is a friend of mine at this point because I just kept following her till she got to know me. And this is on the other side of the case. So this is in support of abortion rights. So 154 distinguished economists and researchers with extensive experience in the field of causal inference. And then the circled part, I don't know how to say that plural. Someone in here does. Amici? Amici submit this brief to assist this court in understanding the development in causal inference methodologies over the last 3 decades. Specifically, Amici seek to highlight for the court how causal inference tools have been used to isolate and measure the impacts of abortion legalization in the United States and to model what would happen if Roe versus Wade were overturned or limited. Next slide. Amici also have an interest in correcting the information before the court, as the state of Mississippi, along with its Amici Curiae, 240 women scholars and professionals and pro-life feminist organizations, hereafter 240 women, have erroneously suggested that it is impossible to measure the impacts of abortion legislation and that abortion access is no longer relevant to women or their families. In fact, there is a substantial body of well-developed and credible research that shows that abortion legalization and access in the United States has had and continues to have a significant effect on birth rates as well as broad downstream social and economic effects, including on women's educational attainment and job opportunities. So in other words, they need to set their record straight because they read that and it wasn't okay. I only read you pieces of that. There were a few different things that went wrong in the initial one. So to give you the short story, the economists proceed to provide a clear, careful description of how statistical methods can help isolate the causal effects of policy. They directly address this correlation-causation concern. They lay out the studies done on abortion and their findings. Indeed, Women have increased educational attainment and financial status when abortion is more easily available. Indeed, waiting periods can lead to later-term abortions. Indeed, abortion availability is associated with higher women's wages. These are research findings. All of these studies have some limitations, but they are very well-regarded research methods, and they are not easy to poke holes in. These are the findings. These economists know what they're talking about. They've done the work, they know the institutional settings, they understand the policy context, they know the geography of it. They've done the work. Their critics come across as uninformed and hostile. Why? Because they were trying to make the wrong contribution. That's my argument. They were making the wrong contribution. They stepped out of their legal expertise, their philosophical expertise, where I think they had the upper hand, and they tried to play a little dirty and just knock down the other guy without having the relevant knowledge to do so. In so doing, their faulty work could mislead policy by refusing to acknowledge real issues faced by women, refusing to acknowledge the real challenges that seem to be causing women to want to get abortions. As I said earlier, the demand question is unanswered, right? We just don't have a lot of information. We do know that the few surveys that are done suggest that women are constrained. They're constrained financially, they're constrained relationally. They often don't have a person who will support them. So I think people of faith need economists. If all of these had worked together, there's whole chunks of these two amicus briefs that are actually quite overlapping about the lack of good supports in the United States, for instance, for parental leave and for women in the workplace. Both sets of these women are very concerned about those things. But because of the way that the case was playing out, it was necessary to downplay those issues because the argument on one side was, no, women are fine, they're equal, they don't need abortion to be equal. And so they really didn't push as hard as they could have on the needs that women and children actually have. Whereas the abortion rights side overplays that piece and makes it seem as if it's actually impossible to have children in a world like this, in policies like we have here. But wait, there's more. You thought we were done. The economists also push beyond what is justified by their findings. They both make this mistake. They make claims about good and harm that economists have no business making. We should not let them. So at the beginning of their brief, they say what its purpose is, and I've underlined a few things. Ample evidence indicates that Roe is causally connected to women's advancements. Abortion policy still matters for women's progress. And if Roe and Casey were overturned, it would have significant negative impact. All of these are values statements. None of the studies are on value statements. The studies are on measured outcomes. But they're attaching those outcomes to values. And they can do that pretty easily because it's not too hard to say, like, poverty is not great and more women will be in poverty. It's true. We have to reckon with that. That's part of our job too, as people of faith, is to not ignore the real challenges that we might face. However, this framing is what allowed them to advocate for one side of the case. Otherwise, their findings would just be informational, right? And then towards the end, given the importance of abortion access to women's reproductive health and decision-making, it follows that eliminating legal protections for abortion would significantly harm women. Studies indicate if they're overturned, hundreds of thousands of women would be forced to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term. We've all heard this kind of language many times. The forced pregnancy language, the harm language. There's a move from the research findings into strong advocacy language. And so we return then to the need for people of faith to be involved. If advocacy language is going to be used, we need to be in that story. We need to be in that narrative, bringing what we have to say. And so my final couple thoughts are economists do important work. They have reasoning skills and technical skills that help us understand the world in ways we otherwise might miss. And people of faith should do the hard work of expressing values and goals that reflect the fact that every square inch of creation is under God's loving, righteous rule, and every person made in his image. We should be loud about that. We don't have to say it in a religious way, and the newest members of the pro-life movement are in large part non-religious. There is a human rights language, there is a non-discrimination language, there are a lot of priorities, a justice language, that also align with our Christian values and priorities and are shared widely and allow us potentially to help contribute to a larger movement. And finally, well-articulated values and goals can drive the questions economic analysts ask and the kinds of policies they evaluate and compare. They do this work better than almost anyone, but we need to help drive what those questions are. And people of faith should not cede the conversation, but work together with economists so that the results of our policies are better aligned with the common good, informed by the valuable contributions of economic analysis. Economists and people of faith really do need each other. Let me know if you'd like to talk more about it. Thanks so much for having me. It's not. You want to take this? Well, then you have to bring it back to me.
The light's on. Issues.
You have to bring it back to me.
I'll run them back and forth. Yep.
Thank you. So as a pastor, like your pastor, I don't know much about economics, but I do play an economist sometimes on Sunday mornings. What I know about econ, I learned from NPR's podcast, Planet Money. So it seems that one of the superstar economists is Raj Chetty. He talks about reducing income inequality, social climbing. It seems as though the church functions as a place where people of different incomes can mix and social climbing can happen. I've not heard Chetty talk much about that. How would you think about his research, social climbing, and the church as a place for people to mix, learn from one another, and benefit?
You want me to walk slower?
Yeah, I think like a lot of research, Raj Chetty's research isn't really thinking about institutions like churches. I find what's interesting to me is this is where the sociologists are actually more helpful because they go live in communities or they go talk to people. There's, I'm not going to remember his name, but maybe someone will know, the man who wrote a book called Dignity. He's originally a photojournalist, I believe, and he was going around America and meeting with rural communities mostly. And Chris Arnaud, yes, that is who it is. Thank you. Arnaud. I've read interviews with him. I have not read his book, which is true for very many people. Because I'm an economist and we write and read articles, and there are very few book opportunities. But his work found, for instance, that he came in thinking from a sort of a usual East Coast perspective of like, oh, these people, they have all of these like fast food restaurants. It's so bad. It's making everybody sick, and they're taking advantage of these poor people. And he got to towns, and he started to realize in every town, the best place to hang out was McDonald's because that was like their third place. That was where people hang out and talk and, do their informal business. And it was only that sort of ethnographic work that uncovered the nature of the sort of informal institutions that people create. I just don't know if Raj or his team, he's got a big team. I don't know if they've thought about this, but it seems to me an opportunity for the church to show, if even if it's not maybe noted yet by Raj Chetty. I have a quick story about Raj Chetty. I went to my dissertation advisor. I was finishing my dissertation. and he said, I want you to apply for the National Tax Association Dissertation Award because I just found out Raj Chetty got it last year, so you might have a chance. They knew Raj Chetty was going to be Raj Chetty before he finished graduate school, at age 21 or something. Raj Chetty is a force of nature. But I don't think he thinks about these things. I've had some similar thoughts on, something you're thinking about is like social climbing, inclusion, those kinds of things. I've thought about this very much on my university campus in terms of what the church on our campus, which is our Christian staff and faculty group, actually is like one of the most diverse and equitable spaces that you could imagine, because it doesn't matter what job you have. You can come to our meetings and we pray together, and we read books together, and we don't read like books that are out of reach. We read books that are readable. And I look around the table and there'll be 12 of us there, and we represent 3 or 4 countries and every race in America and different social groups. And man, it's underappreciated. I thought, boy, the university would love to take a picture of this and pretend that this was a group that they had put together, because this is exactly what they're looking for. The church has a lot to offer that we're not, it's not being seen, but I think we actually are a place that can and does celebrate that diversity, encourage people to, engage cross-culturally, cross-economically, and give people opportunities. So I love that notion, and I don't think it's appreciated yet.
Sarah, I appreciate your talk, of course. It seems like you're making an argument for specialization, that economists are good at doing a small number of things and they should do those things, and people who aren't economists should use economists to do this very narrow set of things. I wonder, though, if you've thought maybe we're just training economists wrong. Should we instead be training economists to be doing ethics and be thinking about justice, or maybe studying history?
What a wonderful question. Yes, we should. But I think I want to try to think of the guardrails I want to put on that. I feel like economists still need to be able to articulate which aspects of what they're doing is about them and their priorities or their beliefs or values, and have the same set of technical skills. So it's definitely not like a reduction in anything, it's just an addition. And it's already really hard. So figuring out what that looks like. So economists are really teched up, and it's just getting worse. I'm a bit of a Luddite, and so I've recently decided that because of AI, I probably will just go extinct. I'm not sure what's going to happen to me. I think, maybe the margin where I feel like we could make some progress incrementally would be for people to think already about the work they're already doing and work on articulating what priorities it pushes forward or what values it's laden with. So one of the things we do a lot in methods courses is try to help people think about what the underlying assumptions are of a method. Like if you're going to use the method correctly, if it's going to reveal the causal impact, these things have to be true. These other explanations have to be ruled out. There's almost a checklist, and it keeps getting longer and longer, of all the things to see if it could be any other explanation than the one you're putting forth to really strengthen your argument. I wonder if there could be something like that. What assumptions are you making in terms of what your reader believes? So this has been just a really interesting conversation I've had with my friends who do this abortion research, because I just go to all their sessions. I've gone to them for years. I've gotten to know them. And like a couple years in, I sort of revealed myself and said, isn't, the fact that not getting abortions makes you poorer just because kids are expensive? is this really about abortion or is this about kids? And is the fact that kids cost money a reason for kids to be killed? Like, I didn't say that part. It wouldn't be worth it. And essentially, one young lady was going on the job market. She was finishing her degree. She did very good work on these laws that have the most brilliantly evil acronym. So I'm not going to remember what the letters stand for, but they're called TRAP laws, T-R-A-P. They're the laws about providers of abortions. So when a state passes TRAP laws, they're those things that restrict, like they need to have a doctor that can come in, or they need to have hospital admitting privileges, or the rooms need to be a certain size. Anything that's basically trying to close down abortion clinics. The people who want abortion rights know that that's what the laws are trying to do, is close abortion clinics. And they absolutely are. That is what they're trying to do. And it's successful, and they close a lot of abortion clinics. But she's doing this research on these TRAP laws and looking at outcomes of women. And I kind of went up, her advisor was there as well. I went up after her talk and just said, if you ever want someone to talk to who would be able to help you know if you're sort of conveying certain assumptions about the life or non-life of the unborn child, like I would be happy to talk to you, because I don't feel like you mean to be, but I think you're making some assumptions that you might want to be careful about. Depending on your audience, they might not really resonate with what you're saying or be able to hear you. The work that you're doing, which is really quality work, if it seems like you're ignoring sort of this main issue. And she's just like, oh, please, yes, oh, I'm not trying to make any statement about anything. Okay. The woman who does all the abortion pill research, who had gotten an award at a conference, they had Q&A. I decided to be like my gutsiest self. She had talked about how she testified before Irish Parliament that these pills don't do any harm. And I said, I think something worth thinking about is what assumptions you're making coming into a statement like that, because it seems as though you are trying to use your work to counter a narrative of like a pro-life narrative. But you said that they do no harm, but what pro-lifers think is that the unborn child, that the fact that they're not alive anymore is harm. And she said, I should be more careful how I say that. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, people are very willing to have these conversations more than I thought, because it's just the water they swim in. They don't even know they're doing it. And so I think having a non-hostile approach, like very much a, hey, fellow traveler, hey, I noticed this. Do you think maybe we should worry about that? I talked to the woman who wrote that, the second amicus brief about that early work on abortion and crime, and she said, boy, that rubs me the wrong way. Like that troubles me, that kind of framing. Like, hey, look, we've got less criminals now. Eugenics, anybody, right? I mean, it's just, and so the people in the literature actually aren't as comfortable as they think, as they show, as they seem to be, and sometimes they haven't even thought about it. So if you've got people in the work that you do that you think might not be able to be talked with, give it a shot. That went way off. We can talk more at dinner.
Okay, last one.
Thank you so much for this. The prevalence of the abortion pill is really interesting, and not to get too much into the weeds, but you had kind of alluded to basically every other measure, intervention, whatever, probably going away. A local data point is interesting, I think since July when you were last here. I was at that conference too. The doctor at the only abortion clinic in town passed away, and there was no one to replace her. And so it closed down, which in some ways is like, wow, there's no abortion clinic in Grand Rapids anymore. That kind of feels great. But I had this sneaking suspicion that doesn't mean that it's actually going away. So I'm curious, as far as some of that literature goes, you mentioned the demand side is understudied, so I won't ask you about something that maybe there just isn't any concrete response. But is there anything I know women who have had abortions, there can be very real psychological trauma years later. Does the pill have a similar effect, or is its kind of less invasive nature less impactful? And in particular, given this audience, for pastoral purposes, this may be the more common way in which, pastor or concerned, Christian actually encounters someone who's had an abortion. What sort of things should they be sensitive to?
Yeah, so to the first issue of physical clinics gradually going away in various places, yeah, the pills are useful for up to 10 or even 12 weeks. I think mostly approved for 10. That's something like 90% of abortions are done within that time frame. And we've moved from about half being pill abortions to more than 60% or something close to 2/3, I think, are pills, just over the last few years. And the federal government's going to help that, I'm sure. And so I do think, so the work on mental health and trauma, that's very contentious. So the set of articles that find that trauma are sometimes really poorly done. So as an example, if you just interview women who came to a counselor after their abortion to talk about it, it turns out that they're very traumatized by their abortions, a large fraction of them. Yeah, right, because they went to a counselor to talk about it. So this is not super helpful. There's not really solid research on it as far as I can tell. The abortion rights movement disavows all that work. There are certainly published papers that say there's no evidence of a mental health effect, but there's published papers that say that there is, and I have not figured that whole thing out. Whether it changes with the pill, I think, is a fascinating question. My first reaction to thinking about this is, if you think about what, and I didn't share this other quote from Frederica Matthews Green, but she makes these wonderful points that once abortion is available, it's the most convenient thing for everyone around the woman. And her decision not to do that is seen as just very weird and stubborn, because why would you create all these problems you can just solve? And so when you think about how isolating that experience already is, and now you just do it privately. You don't even have a nurse at the abortion clinic holding your hand. You are just alone in your house going through excruciating pain, and then it's done and no one ever has to know. I have to think that has effects. I think physically the trauma is very similar to a miscarriage, is my understanding of what it feels like, and I think that's a pretty bad feeling. But we don't have anything studying them, and what I worry is we never will, because we won't know about them. So it's one of those things that's just so hard to study. It's like if you want to keep studying COVID cases, well, we're not reporting them anymore. So I don't know how we will ever accept sort of aggregates. We could maybe know how many pills are, I don't even know if we can know how many pills are consumed in a county or something to figure out whether there's some county level mental health effect, but I don't think we're going to have any idea who had abortions, even less than we did before. So I'm very pessimistic about the ability to study them. And I think this is why I go to the demand side is everything, because I don't think the supply side can be constrained. It couldn't hardly be before, but now it just really can't. And so it has to be the case that we create an environment where women don't feel that their child is an enemy. Or an interruption or a problem. And the labor market is doing us no favors by treating women as problematic men when they have babies. So, sorry, that's a downer. Jeez. Whew, what a rough ending. Thank you.
The schedule's in your program. I think we reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I'm not great with time or schedules, but I think that's right. So have a great evening. See you all here tomorrow. Thank you.